Greetings, science fiction and fantasy enthusiasts. Do you read books? Do you watch films? Do you hate deodorant? Then welcome to our podcast. You're listening to No Deodorant in Outer Space with Ryan Sean O'Reilly. Now, let's get started.
No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed, by some, to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of No Deodorant in Outer Space. My name is Ryan Sean O'Reilly, and I am welcoming you back for a special haunted edition of No Deodorant in Outer Space. Joining me on this special episode, I have two returning guests. I have Amanda Andros.
Hello.
Amanda, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm excellent.
Good.
I'm happy to have you here this evening.
Yes.
And also joining us all the way from Michigan, through the virtues of the internet, is Laura Valle.
Hello.
Laura, how are you?
All the way from Michigan. I'm great. How are you guys?
All the way from Michigan straight to our ear holes.
Yes.
We're doing good. So you guys have both been on the podcast before, so the audience should be somewhat familiar with you. Amanda, you were on this season when we previously covered James Tiptree Jr.
Yes.
And we did a nice little episode there. Laura, you previously were on when we did Clive Barker, I believe.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, that was
That was a good one.
Yeah, that was like a season 3, I believe. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The audiences can go back and listen to those if they want to hear a little bit more about you. But I will say, we mentioned this previously, Amanda, you're, pursuing playwriting.
Right.
And you're still doing that, doing your writing and anything
now,
else new with that?
I'm taking a class on political playwriting.
Oh, nice.
So,
especially in this environment.
Yes.
Yeah.
With the current administration, sorry, no offense, but a lot of the stuff I write is political in varying undercurrents. So yeah,
and I think a lot of plays have that, and and science fiction is known for having a lot of political undertones.
Right.
I mean, we covered 1984 on this, just to name one. But I mean,
yep.
We also did a book called Roadside Picnic, which was written by these Russian brothers who were able to, I think, get away with saying, a lot more under the communist rule over there because it was considered science fiction, so it wasn't scrutinized by the censors as much.
Yep. Yeah. So no, I'm writing right now I'm working on a play about gun control and violence in schools. So it's cathartic.
Two casual topics.
Yeah. Two casual topics. It's a feel good night at the theater. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I think theater should make you think. So I am it's not a love story by any means. It's serious stuff, but that's how I write. I don't, I'm not writing a musical. I'm not writing a love story. If you want to go see that, please don't go see my plays. So yeah, which they're not even in the theater yet, but maybe one day. I might get a reading or something. Yeah. So
certainly something to strive for. Yeah.
It's fun. It's fun. I enjoy it, and I love just the craft of being with other writers because I feel like they are the same people as I am, and I feel like I'm part of a community finally as opposed to the miscreant I've always felt growing up as. So
well, I think a lot of artistic people feel that way until they get older and kind of get out there.
Yep.
And Laura, I know Dave talked about in the last episode he was on that you guys are not doing your horror podcast or your true crime podcast, but you still have.
We were getting death threats, so we had to
stop.
Oh
my gosh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah, he mentioned that. But he said that you still have your didn't you have like a blog, Major Horror, or Facebook page group?
Yeah. I know. I feel a little bit like a Philistine with you two writers, but yeah, no, I do not write, but I read and watch a shit ton of horror and science fiction movies. So that's what I bring to the table. And actually, a lot of horror is kind of, there's political kind of underneath, core feelings, if you kind of look at things through the, different eras of it too. So
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
Yeah. But is that Major Horror, is that primarily a Facebook page?
Well, it was a blog. See, yeah, I have many creative interests, but I have a really short attention span. So it was a blog at one point and then became a Facebook page. Now it's pretty much it's a pretty big Facebook page, but I pretty much just post, trailers and bullshit. But we're hoping to get...
I like bullshit. It's great.
I can't believe I said to Dave, I know.
It fits right in with the rest of the internet.
The masses love bullshit because, I used to try to craft these, I'd make I'd put time into putting in blog posts and 2 people would like it. Now I just repost a stupid meme and there's 47 shares. I'm oh, well, I guess this is what
glasses.
People want. Yeah. So, but we're hoping to do a podcast at some point that's about horror movies just because we like to watch and talk about them.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah, that's
cool. Something to look for on the horizon with you as well.
Yeah.
All right. I think in the previous episodes, you guys have kind of talked about the stuff that you're interested in, like books and stuff like that. So we can kind of move on and say what we're going to talk about in this particular episode, which is going to be the book, The Haunting of Hill House, which I, for some reason, felt the need to pick up and put in my hand while I'm saying it, written by Shirley Jackson, as well as the 2 movie versions. One came out, I think, in 1963, and the other one came out in 1999.
99.
Yeah, and they're both called The Haunting.
Yes.
So we'll be discussing those. And then, if you ladies agree, there's going to be another version coming out by Netflix, a miniseries called The Haunting.
Yeah.
And it's actually coming out after we record this, but before I release the episode. So what I'd like to do is have us reconvene, maybe next month, and through the magic of podcasting, record our thoughts and reflections on that and kind of put that with this, okay?
Yeah.
So
Sounds good.
We'll revisit the subject later. But for now, we can get into the book. So as I like to start off every episode, is just try to get an opening comment from everyone to try to summarize your thoughts on the book. If you can somehow just kind of put together and ideally one sentence, what your takeaway from the book, and then we'll delve into more detail later. So I'll start things off, and I kind of wrote out a quote. This is my take on reading this book. So I felt like it was a place of nuanced genius where psychological suspense meets the supernatural, highlighting the lulls of reality in which we deceive ourselves while we all slowly tilt toward an inevitable yet predictable whiz-bang ending. So that was kind of the summary of my thoughts.
That was very erudite.
Oh, thank you.
Wonder, I did not write that.
I should just pretend like I just came up with it off the top of my head.
It's
right, you got to give us these assignments ahead of time.
Seriously, how am I going to top that? That's
you guys have both been on the show before, so you've been put on the spot.
Outdone by the host.
Perhaps it's been a while.
No.
But I mean, I confess that I wrote that out ahead of time. So
extremely prolific.
But let's go to you, Amanda. Just if you had to just kind of summarize, your impression of the book, just real succinctly, when you finished this book and you put it down, what was your kind of thought?
I think it's the embodiment of psychological darkness. That's how I describe it. It's a manifestation of horror in a physical sense.
Very apropos.
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Very good. And you just came up with that on the spot.
I did, but I didn't write it down, and I wasn't as prolific. But
it still counts.
It's okay. Good.
All right, Laura.
All right, and here comes the least articulate summary of the book. Well, I think it really what's so haunting about The Haunting of Hill House is the sort of devastating character study of the protagonist.
Yes.
And just sort of watching this, sort of ascent into hopefulness and then crashing descent to hopelessness. That's sort of what stuck with me through this, after the book, and it's kind of been lingering after I finished it.
God, what you said, it was very, very good. It makes me think of just this post I put on Instagram recently. I was just at my parents' house, and they have these bur oak trees, and they're just dumping acorns now on their lawn and their driveway. And on the driveway, they just get run over by the cars and stuff. So I took a real close-up picture for Instagram of just a couple acorns, and one of them is this pristine, and you can see it right in the forefront of the shot. And then there's just a smashed, obliterated one behind it. And I just called it hope and despair. It just makes me think about what you just said.
So dark.
It's very depressing. Yeah.
Happy Halloween, everyone.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes, 'tis the season.
Grotesque. Yeah.
But it's
true.
That's this book.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move things along and kind of get into the bio section here. The author that we're discussing on this episode is Shirley Jackson, of course. She was born December 14th, 1916. She died rather young, August 8th, 1965. I believe she was 48. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She's from English, like an English family, English descent. She had wealthy and notable ancestors. There was lawyers, judges, an architect in her family background. They grew up in an affluent, middle-class suburb out in California. At a very young age, I think she took to writing poetry and short stories, much to the chagrin of her mother, I believe. And I believe she also had a strained relationship with her mother, who married young and was pregnant fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. Disappointed she couldn't spend more time with her husband before the baby was born, was what I read, which is just a depressing thing to think that Shirley Jackson had to know that's what her mother was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's I think a couple biographies, and we talked about this, Laura. I think you ordered one of them.
Yeah.
And the biographer was being interviewed on a podcast I listened to. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to that.
I listened to it today. It was she was really good. It was
Ruth
interesting.
Franklin, I think, is the biographer.
Yeah.
And she tells this story on there that Shirley Jackson's mother, was watching one of her kids or all of her kids. They went to California to stay with her. And when the child returned back to Shirley's own mother sent a bill with the child to say,
great.
Here's what you owe me for the outfits and the meals that I spent on my own granddaughter.
Oh my God.
That's how
a terrible woman.
What a loving mother.
Terrible.
that's
I think
her babysitting fees.
They had a toxic relationship, but mostly it was from mom. It was not from Shirley.
Right.
She just never loved her. And she never, Shirley, what's sad is she never lived up to mom's standards. I think mom always thought she was frumpy and not taking care of herself.
And she did struggle with her weight throughout her life, at least especially early on, and then later in her life, it was a significant problem.
Why can't you look more feminine and things like that? Yeah, with the weight.
Sad.
Yeah, it's sad.
And I think that made her feel like an outsider.
Yes.
And like we were just talking about being artistic, that a lot of people can feel that way.
Absolutely.
And even people who are not artistic can feel that way. But her family moved to New York for her later schooling when she went into high school. And when she finished, she went to the local university there at University of Rochester. Mm-hmm. The comment that I saw on Wikipedia was that that's where her parents, because she was going so close to school, her parents could supervise her studies. So that's kind of interesting.
Great. Yeah. Another fabulous caveat.
It didn't work out because she disliked the experience. And within a year, it wasn't necessarily a year, but she withdrew. She didn't complete her studies there, but she did spend a year back home just writing, focusing on her writing, producing, I think on her website, or a website dedicated to her, saying that she produced at least 1,000 words a day during that year, and then decided to go back to school, but this time she went to Syracuse University, which I looked on Google Maps. I think that's an hour away, so that was probably enough to get a little distance from the family. And it proved to be very good experience for her because she flourished there, and she eventually earned a bachelor's degree in journalism. She also had her first publication there. She did a short story about a teen's attempted suicide called Janice.
Yep.
Right from the get-go, she was into these feel-good stories.
Of course. She was great. She was a genius. That's why, it was fabulous. No genius writes about happy-go-lucky all the time. I truly believe that.
There's not too many happy-go-lucky stories that are popular.
No one really wants to read that, which is interesting. It's not entertaining.
Yeah.
It's bland and harlequin romance. You're standing in the aisle watching Lifetime, or it's not literature. Sorry.
No.
Yeah. Anyway.
So while at Syracuse, she also worked as the fiction editor at the campus humor magazine. While working on the magazine, she met her future husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman.
Oh, he was a wonderful man.
Yeah.
He's also an interesting guy. Good old Stanley.
Stan, yeah.
I saw a note there. I didn't see much more about this, but the two founded a literary magazine called Spectre with him as editor. So I don't know if they did that while they were in college or right when they got out.
That sounds like college. I thought that was my impression, that maybe they were in college.
Because they got married, I think, right after college, right? It was pretty quick.
Yeah, but she didn't want to marry him at first.
Well, it was, it was a struggle because he was Jewish. And I don't think she cared, but she knew her family would care.
Her parents were,
Yep.
Yeah, and it was a different time. And I think they got married, and I think her mother didn't even know the actual marriage date for a while.
That's right.
Until she had her first kid, maybe.
Yeah. That's a good question. Maybe she was...
They definitely didn't announce it ahead of time.
Right. They
waited.
But he was courting her a lot, and I think it was my impression that he asked her to marry her a couple times.
I believe
and she said no, I think.
Well, and didn't he declare after he read her story in some school newspaper that he would marry the author of that story?
Yes,
which sounds romantic, and then kind of stalkerish and cocky at the same time.
Yeah.
Well.
But she was with her female friend a lot, too. They had a very close relationship. She was that one French young woman.
In college?
In college.
Oh.
And that was in the podcast, too, that we listened to, is that they had a very kind of an enmeshed relationship. They were very close to each other. There was a quarrel, and she went back to France. And
the other woman did.
Yeah, and Shirley never really recovered over that. Yeah. It was a close relationship. Yeah.
Didn't she have a fan do that too, that she was kind of close to?
She did.
Yeah,
like a pen pal, and then the pen pal stopped. It was a fan, and then she eventually just stopped answering Shirley's letters, which is just so sad.
Yeah, and then after her death, I think she came forward because she still had all the letters.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And produced them. Yeah.
Yeah. There were multi-tiers to this woman. And I think,
for sure.
I think that in the times, there were rumors that both in her characterizations of her, that she could have been bisexual. And that could be true because back in those days, obviously you were in the closet if you were bisexual.
Right. Yeah.
So
although didn't the biographer say there was no evidence of it in the writing or in her private writing and stuff? There was she didn't talk about anything in any of her.
They allude to Theo, the character
in the fiction,
but not in the private writing. But people maybe assumed because of her close relationship with her friend that maybe they were together.
It might be something she just kept. But who knows?
There was never.
She might have been so repressing that so much to the point of not even putting it in her journals, or it might have just been so outside the realm of what she would have been open to.
Exactly, but we don't really know if that's true or not. It's been put out there. So that's another part.
Nonetheless, she did get married to Stanley.
Yes,
good old Stanley. They briefly went to New York and kind of worked odd jobs, and she started getting published when they did this. She got published early on in the New Republic and the New Yorker. Their first child was born. And one of her stories, called Come Dance With Me in Ireland, was chosen for Best American Short Stories. So that was, I think, one of the early praises of her work. And she got many more throughout her career. They eventually moved to North Bennington, Vermont in 1945 to an old house there so that Stanley could take a position as an instructor at the college there, though he actually lacked a postgraduate degree. And I remember, I think the biographer was saying that this was kind of a more progressive school. I think it catered towards women and I guess, just catered towards women and teaching women. So they were more open to the professors that they hired to attract them to the school. And it was filled, I think, with professors like Stanley who were, I guess, accomplished in working in their fields, but they didn't necessarily have the higher degrees.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So he takes this position. A couple years later, 1948, she publishes her first novel, The Road Through the Wall, which is a sort of semi-autobiographical story about her time growing up in California. And then that same year, it's a huge year for her because the New Yorker publishes her most famous story, The Lottery.
Yep.
Ooh, it's such a good one.
It's really...
I feel like most people should know that story.
And most people do because a lot of people, I think, read it in high school.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's when it's part of a literary canon.
Yeah.
So you've come across it.
Yes.
And I feel like it gets referenced in pop culture. Yep. So I mean, it's such a chilling that was all I had ever read by her until I read this just now. And now I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to want to read her other works. But
Yeah, because she has other stuff.
You know, she kind of reminds me of Flannery O'Connor in a way.
In what way?
Well, with just the suddenness of the horror. It's simple, but it comes on you so fast. Like, it's just like the words kind of strike you and you're left dumbfounded with the gravity of the situation. The language can be very sparse, but it can mean so much, you know, because then the ending line of the lottery, I can't remember what it said, but basically she's being stoned.
Right.
She's saying
Spoiler
something
alert.
like it's not fair,
Yeah,
right?
sorry, I ruined that.
Sorry.
That story from 1948.
If you guys
1948.
don't know it, if you don't know it now,
You know what happened.
No, I think, isn't the character saying it's not fair or it
That's
isn't
what-
fair or
yeah.
something like that? And it's just like, it's chilling.
It's
just,
chilling.
It gives you that
Yeah.
like sick feeling where it's just dread.
You know, she wrote that in just like a couple hours, I guess.
Yeah.
She was like between errands of picking up her kids,
yeah.
right?
Well, that's the thing. She was so natural at it. It was like breathing. And when a writer can do that, they're gifted. It's a gifted way of kind of, if you can write it and it can be that profound in a very sparse amount of time. And I'm using sparse a lot, but you're beyond talented. That's a gift. That's a gift.
You know, it's not
amazing.
always a guarantee like that.
Right.
Some of that has to do with luck.
And they said that, you know, that's kind of that was her story. Like she said, I was walking my daughter in her stroller it was a sunny day, went to the grocery store, whatever. I came home and I wrote it that afternoon and I sent it off with no edits. And then later they said they found drafts. And so she did edit it. So, you know, but I think that whole idea must have struck her.
Very quickly.
It could certainly happen like that. Like, because I always remember hearing the story about Black Sabbath, the metal band. They have a famous song called Paranoid. And apparently
good one.
They wrote that one just like off the cuff in the studio as like a filler. They were like, we need an extra track for this album. So like, let's come up with something. And they just came up with that on the spot.
Great.
And then it's a huge hit.
It's a lark.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a similar thing. Sometimes it's just, but you know, it's not just dumb luck like you're saying, because it's years of working on this craft and then it pays off.
That's true.
In this moment.
But sometimes there's been times where there have been writers who write very quickly and it takes off. Sometimes they don't go through multiple drafts.
Stars align and things just...
doesn't Stephen King sit down supposedly with no outline, which is always kind of insane.
Well, that's a style. Some writers are like that.
Yeah, they have a way of writing.
Some writers outline, and some of them are more seat of the pants. They call it pantsing, and they just write off the cuff. But that story, we should note, is very noted for... Well, the critics all loved it, but it also, because it supposedly received like just record numbers of hate mail for the New Yorker, like over 300 letters. It was like the largest the magazine ever received for like a piece of fiction.
And that's how you know it's good.
Yeah. Now, the biographer did make the comment that like the way Shirley couched it was that like it was like all hate mail, but the biographer said it wasn't necessarily all hate mail.
It was confusion.
A lot of it was confusion. What does this story mean?
Right.
But,
when I read that in something that people some people thought it had actually happened. They wanted to know, where is this town? Or something like, where is this happening? As if it was like this real, you know.
Well, that's what we were saying before, that the public can easily be duped.
That is
you
true.
know, and like mass hysteria over a piece of literature or art. Yeah, you know.
So after this, and just the next year in 1949, the family moves to Westport, Connecticut, for about 2 years so that Stanley can pursue a career as a literary critic. He primarily focuses on writing works about critical methodology and the patterns and limitations which critics sometimes fall back on to do their work. He published a few books and wrote regularly for The New Yorker as a staff writer as well as The New Leader. He was also a jazz critic and wrote like hundreds of essays on this. He loved the academic life and the prestige which came with it and was fond of his position and entertaining. The two often had, various artistic people over, and sometimes they stayed with them. One person noted was this Ralph Waldo Ellison, who's the author of The Invisible Man. That guy completed that novel while he was in residence with them. Starting in 1951, Shirley would publish a succession of Gothic novels, starting with Hangs a Man, which was based on a real-life unsolved disappearance of a student from the local college, a student named Paula Jean Weldon, who mysteriously disappeared in the wilderness not far from where Shirley lived. She also used this incident for inspiration for her short story, Just an Ordinary Day. The true event actually took place in 1946, and it remains unsolved to this day. And criticism of the way the local sheriffs handled it led to the establishment of the Vermont State Police. So that was a big story for her that she came up with just based on the area that she was in and she researched. They eventually moved back to North Bennington, I think, in 1951, and they kind of stay there the rest of the time. The following year after they moved back, the lottery was adapted for television for the first time. In 1969, Encyclopedia Britannica made a version of the lottery that actually was the film debut for Ed Begley Jr. and is considered one of the 2 best-selling educational films ever. She was a bit more private. When we talk about the lottery, I kind of wondered if she was more private about her, talking about her work because of the reaction to the lottery. That just made me wonder if it was that or just her own personality. But she did publish fictionalized memoirs about her domestic life. But when she was asked to provide autobiographical material, she described her life as with a sort of bare chronological outline. And I saw some quotes on Wikipedia that I wanted to say because I thought they kind of like summed up who she was. She stated that she lived in a quiet rural community with fine scenery and comfortably far away from city life, noting that our major exports are books and children, both of which we produce in abundance. Both Shirley and Stanley were huge readers. Obviously, Stanley, with his work as a critic. And I saw somewhere that they were estimated to have like 100,000 books in their personal library, although the biographer, I think, kind of put it around more like 25 to 30,000.
Right.
Shirley described her memoirs, there's 2 of them, which I'll talk about next, as sort of like in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way. She said that they were disrespectful memoirs of her children. Stanley and Shirley had 4 children together. She chronicles her domestic life in a series of humorous, somewhat fictionalized short stories that were published in various women's magazines such as Good Housekeeping, Women's Day, Mademoiselle, and Collier's Magazine.
And that's interesting because that's what writers of the day did. They did that because they wanted to publish. So they'd publish in these female journals.
Right.
Sylvia Plath started out the same way.
Oh.
She was she was like a society writer, I think, for Good Housekeeping or something like that. So they couldn't be taken seriously unless it was under the guise of housewives, which it's sad. But it's also how they broke out into the literary world as women writers. They were expected to be domestic. So
like I like that story about, or I didn't really like it, but it was the story where she was in the hospital having her 3rd child or something, and the clerk was saying, what's your occupation? And she said writer, and they said, I'll just put down housewife.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, God.
Terrible. Yeah. And
so she's this accomplished writer. No, sorry.
No, you're a housewife.
No, just a housewife.
Housewife. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. I think I wrote that down. That was pretty stuck out.
Yeah.
It's bad.
So these stories, which are different than her horror, it's more like humorous, although there's humor, I think, in her horror stuff too. But they're eventually collected into these memoirs. The first one came out in 1953. It was called Life Among the Savages. And it was described by another writer, Joyce Carol Oates, in an interview I listened to. It's sort of like the lighter side of things, but with a twist. A follow-up came out in 1957 called Raising Demons. You gotta love these titles about her kids.
Yeah, sound a little sort of self-deprecating air to them, which is kind of fun.
Right.
But both books were praised when they were released, but the critics noted that there was a change in tone in the latter book, and it was kind of not as lighthearted. Another anecdote that the biographers jokingly made was that Stanley, which I think the character of that she depicts as the father in there is kind of like bumbling and stuff in these stories.
Oh, yeah.
And Stanley, I guess,
didn't like that.
Was
Mr. Magoo.
He didn't like that, and he was like that. And they made a comment that like he didn't even know how to make his own coffee.
Yeah.
God.
He was useless, basically.
He was busy with his criticisms.
But I think he was also living off of her writing.
Eventually, yeah.
Not yet, but
pretty quickly,
that was happening. And
it was like a sort of a secret.
We're jumping ahead of the story, but like I think that eventually she became extremely depressed and couldn't even get out of bed. Yeah, and then he was saying, "Well, take classes, get writing again, get on the creative process." Well, she was the cash cow.
Yeah.
So it makes you
the golden goose.
It makes you hate Stanley even more.
Yeah. Although
Not totally, but
I feel like he probably did
cheered
believe
her on.
Yeah, he did believe in her writing.
She was a good writer.
Yeah.
He was just a terrible husband and I think not a great father either. It sounded like he was pretty distant and disconnected.
He was a cheater. He was a cheater with his young female students. And,
and like
as
an
a
unabashed
professor.
cheater. She was all in the open. She knew about it. And she wanted him to stop and he just wouldn't.
Well, he wanted to have an open relationship, and I think the biographer said that she reluctantly went along with it, though it bothered her and it caused problems. And it sounds like it was something like that she knew about and they got mad about, and then she kind of got over, and like maybe I don't want to say she accepted it, but she just kind of like went along with it, and then it would flare up again to the point where it bothered her. Like I don't think she was ever really okay with it, but I think she never took steps to divorce him, as far as I could tell.
No.
So she was just kind of putting up with it.
But
maybe she was just hoping it would stop or something.
She was hoping, but also what struck me is she learned how to drive. There's that part of the story where she learned how to drive. I don't think Stanley knew how to drive.
I don't know.
And then she was kind of free. And
she was free, and she would take to the road.
Yeah.
And it gave her a sense of liberation.
Yeah.
Because I think all of her life she had been stifled. Like from her mom and she never had a sense of freedom.
I wonder if she was codependent. I don't know if her relationship with her mother was like that, and then she kind of like glommed on to Stanley. Because, she never left him, so something was going on there.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe she didn't think anything else better would come along, or she didn't have that power to leave him. There were a lot of, I think you're right about the codependency, but the driving, that struck me because that's a person who wants to be liberated.
Yeah, because she did it later in life.
And she loved to drive, and that says immense things about what was going on at home, in her home life with just in general, with just taking to the road and forgetting her positioning maybe for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, Stanley was sort of a traditional kind of macho-esque guy because he had a heavy hand with the household finances, and he even controlled her own earnings, which, like you said, after the lottery came out, she earned a lot more than him.
The breadwinner.
Exactly.
And he would actually dole out her income to her, like almost like a allowance. So
the patriarchy.
God, as bad as the patriarchy is now, God, I can't even imagine back then.
We're in the midst of patriarchy right now, and and dear viewers, we're not offending anyone or listeners, but there's a lot of patriarchy in society today still. I think we're better than we were back in the times of Shirley.
Right.
But I feel like...
Yeah, this is like the 50s.
This was the 50s, and it was very traditional and very black and white. But what's interesting is she wrote about both female prototypes. There's that thing, too, that she wrote about the vampy woman, but she also wrote about the very pure and kind of Pollyanna-like woman, and they would appear sometimes in the stories together. There would be those two sides of the women, which was fascinating as well, because it kind of shows where her mind was at. And
the biographer noted that the vast majority of her protagonists were women.
Yes.
Right.
Females.
Yeah.
And I think there was some theorizing that maybe that is why she's kind of been overlooked. She's regarded as for the lottery and stuff, but probably hasn't gotten quite the praise that she deserved. And they thought that maybe when her stories came out, she was always writing about female protagonists, and that might have been one of the reasons why critics at the time overlooked her stuff more.
Right. Yeah.
Probably likely.
Yes.
Stanley, not a great husband.
No.
He's got issues. He's having relationships with students.
In the house.
Yeah.
Including one that I think that was kind of like Shirley had kind of befriended, right? And she would come over and...
you're right.
It devastated her.
I remember hearing that too. So it sounds like it was a problem that like flared up, and then maybe like it calmed down, and then she thought it was okay, and then it would just like, then she'd find out about a new one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the impression I got.
Yeah.
Despite all that, her literary success would continue to great acclaim. In 1954, even though I just said she was overlooked, but she was acknowledged in some ways. She was making good money. In 1954, she published The Bird's Nest, which was about a woman with multiple personalities in a relationship with her psychiatrist. This was adapted for a film and retitled Lizzie. It wasn't a major success, And I don't think she was totally happy with some of the changes they made to her story. But I mean, any writer whose stuff's getting turned into like films or TV shows, I mean, that's a step up.
Pretty successful.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And by any measure.
Yeah.
She herself saw a psychiatrist and struggled with various health issues. Yeah. She drank. She was overweight, like we said, when she was younger, but when she was older, she was overweight, and she smoked heavily, and she had a heart problem. She suffered from pain and exhaustion, and she was prone to fainting spells because of her heart issues. I also heard somewhere that like her house was sort of unkempt, and she suffered from anxiety, and eventually she developed agoraphobia and wouldn't go out, and she was prescribed barbiturates, and at some point she also had prescriptions for amphetamines to deal with her weight loss. And so that led to a pattern of cyclical drug abuse.
Yeah, up and down.
And she tried to counteract the drug effects with other drugs. That actually kind of, not that particular struggle, but it reminded me a little bit about Philip K. Dick, who we covered 3 other times, at least in this podcast. And I'm going to recover him again because he abused amphetamines, but I think he did it to like increase his writing output. Mm-hmm. I think we talked about that in the episode on Total Recall, but not good stuff. And I think they might have even said that, was it taking the barbiturates might have actually made her anxiety worse.
Sure.
So it just was not a good situation. Yeah. So she was unhappy. She confessed this to friends. She also felt patronized being the quote unquote like faculty wife of Stanley.
Again.
I mean, that probably had to be like a double slap in the face since she was the breadwinner.
Right.
And he wasn't even like a great guy. I mean, he's like cheating on her with students.
She's an accessory on his arm,
right?
Basically.
Even though she was clearly more talented and more successful.
Yeah, his own writing. He was published in New Yorker and stuff, but he didn't become this huge critic. I think that he had hoped he would be. His books and stuff. I think the biographer was saying like he wrote a book about criticism about critics, and he frequently derided critics. And then when he went to publish the book and get blurbs from these same critics that he was criticizing and deriding, they were like, no, I'm not going to blurb your book. You talk smack about me.
Imagine that.
Well, it came around and bit him.
Yes.
Because, and then what kind of success are you going to have off of that?
Yeah, and you're going to get probably bad reviews if you criticized all the reviewers and...
You didn't use common sense.
It's kind of an interesting concept, though, to study criticism. But
criticism is...
To critique criticism, that's...
Yes, but that's part of any English student obviously takes literary criticism courses in their classes. But to be a critic of the criticism...
that's tricky.
When people are already critics and you criticize them, it gets kind of... in the soup, as they say. You're not going to be highly regarded. So,
So she feels ostracized, which makes you think of the lottery, and probably added to her inspiration of the lottery, because she just didn't connect with the local townspeople there. And there was an incident they recalled on the podcast interview of the biographer where I guess when they moved to their home there, one of their moving boxes fell open and all these books were exposed. And the mover saw that a lot of the books were communist literature because they had crap ton of books, and I don't know, they probably had different varying interests, but apparently this was reported to the FBI. And
Red Scare.
The biographer actually pulled the FBI file on them. I don't think it amounted to anything, but they were, I guess the FBI was concerned that they were a storehouse for communist literature because they had so many freaking books.
Well, it was the Hoover era, right?
Right.
J. Edgar Hoover.
So they were looking out for this stuff.
Yeah, he was all over the place.
Yeah.
Everyone was blacklisted, and you're going in front of Congress.
McCarthyism and all that.
Arthur Miller is a prime example of someone who was constantly called and questioned. And some of his work is communistic, and socialist, but people got called up. Directors, actresses,
Philip
authors.
K. Dick was investigated by the FBI too. Yeah, like a lot of writers were. A lot of people.
They didn't trust the intellectuals.
No, they didn't because they're evil and spawns of Satan. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's it.
So speaking of spawns of Satan,
yes,
the Haunting of Hill House was her 5th novel.
By the way, she was very interested in the occult.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I was
going to bring that up.
What did you guys find about that? Because I remember hearing that. I mean, I got the impression that she feels like people exaggerated it a bit too much.
Well, I think her grandmother was a Christian Scientist, right? Yes. But like a healer and would do... some of that sort of, occulty kind of
faith
spiritualism kind of stuff. So I think she kind of...
There was a story about her brother breaking his arm, and then the mom and grandma prayed over him
Yeah.
And Shirley felt guilty about it because they didn't take him to a hospital.
Right.
What did you guys see about her interest in the occult and stuff?
Well, I think that kind of had led into it somehow. I think that same grandmother, there was some of that kind of overlap with that and kind of spirits healing and stuff. And I think she had an interest in, I think that I'm guessing, not to get into the book yet, but all that sort of the planchette and all that was kind of hip in the 40s and 50s, maybe, as kind of a, the Ouija boards were, was kind of an interesting little thing that people would dabble in. But I think there must have been some review or somebody of hers called her a witch or something. And I think she kind of didn't, she didn't totally, she kind of, she wasn't really, but I don't think she totally
denied it.
Yeah. Because of course that made her sound more interesting and
sure.
Wasn't there an anecdote?
She should have said that at the hospital when she had her third kid.
Exactly.
Right. I'm a witch.
I'm a witch. That's my occupation. No, there was a story about a gentleman friend, and they did a seance, in his apartment or something. He said, we're going to talk to the devil.
Yeah, didn't she get freaked out? And
she was she was horrified by that experience.
Stanley gave her a hard time about it.
And she never wanted to talk about it again. But I think he really made contact with something that night, and it totally freaked her out. Because
creepy.
They actually, I think, did talk to the devil in that apartment. So she went a little too far there, and she pulled back, but she always had a fascination with darker forces.
And I think she had a little bit of that kind of belief in that kind of thing, that there was this sort of otherworldly stuff out there.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Like I said, the Haunted of Hill House was her fifth novel. It's like gothic horror. It kind of sort of mixes supernatural phenomena with psychology. Stephen King noted it as one of the most important horror novels of the 20th century in his review book, Danse Macabre.
Danse Macabre, yeah.
Yeah, which he talks about a lot of stuff. I think he discusses the first paragraph of the book, which I think that's where that quote came from that I read.
It's a brilliant opening paragraph.
Yeah. It's considered the quintessential haunted house story.
Yes.
And the first film adaptation came out actually during her lifetime. She received an Edgar Allan Poe Award for Louisa Please in 1961, and the next year her best-selling novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, was included in the year's 10 best novels by Time magazine. This is recently adapted for film, and did that already come out?
I think it's gonna come out.
It's gonna come out.
Right. Yeah.
This year? Later
cool.
this year?
Yeah. It's supposed to be her possibly even more her masterpiece than
I think I've heard that.
Haunting of Hill House.
It's definitely equal
I'm dying
or
to read
better.
it.
Yeah.
I'd love to read it too after this one.
So she also wrote, interestingly enough, some juvenile literature during her life, including a one-act musical take on Hansel and Gretel called The Bad Children. And she would also review children's books for the New York Herald Tribune. She was invited to teach at a writers' conference and was awarded a medal from Syracuse University, but she was unable to attend that due to her illness. She died of heart failure at the age of 48 while taking her afternoon nap.
Yep.
And was cremated per her request. The biographer noted that she died sort of on the upswing of her career, kind of at the pinnacle. And while she was recovering from her illness, with actually 2 incomplete works, a children's work and a novel, I think, entitled Come Away With Me, about a woman escaping her life, which were published posthumously, I think probably by Stanley.
Well, at least he did that, right?
Yeah, he needed, he's going to get that money.
Right.
He wants the money, but at
he had
least
to have someone help him make coffee.
Yeah, exactly. One of his students.
It's fascinating that later, more of her writing was found in an old barn behind the house.
Oh, cool.
And in 2013, a new story was published. Oh, in 2013, another news story was published because they found something else in the Library of Congress where her papers were stored. So you had a collection come out before that where they found stuff in the barn by her house. And then in 2013, there was another story.
Yeah.
She sort of came from the pulp tradition, which we've talked about in this podcast, like Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert Howard, H.P. Lovecraft. Her stuff wasn't really necessarily genre, as other critics have said, but she was criticized for that, even though she was kind of more on the edge of it. And like I said, like a lot of her protagonists were females. And then, so recently there's been sort of a resurgence and reevaluation of her work. And there've been various critical studies and collections and essays and biographies written about her. Like we talked about, there was a recent biography by Ruth Franklin that was discussed on this other podcast, Good Morning Nancy, that I really liked that podcast.
I loved that.
It
was
was a great podcast.
I'll put a link to that
really
on the
entertaining.
website.
It was hilarious.
Yeah.
It was a really good summary of her life based on that biography. And then the interview with the biographer. And then the biography sounds very interesting. She had an interesting life.
Yeah.
If a short-lived one, sort of.
Oh, yeah.
I think there's going to be a fictionalized film about living with her and Stanley that stars Elizabeth Moss from Mad Men.
Oh, I'd totally watch that.
I'm not sure when that's coming out, but there's something coming out.
Yeah.
Sort of like a fictionalized take about what it would be like to have lived with them.
So is Elizabeth Moss, I'm
Shirley
assuming
Jackson.
she's Shirley Jackson.
I believe so.
Interesting casting. Yeah.
She was in Mad Men and The Handmaid's Tale, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Wow.
In 2007, they established the Shirley Jackson Awards, which is held at ReaderCon, and they're for the outstanding achievement in literature of psychological suspense, horror, and the dark fantastic. Her career spanned just 2 decades, and she had 6 novels, 2 memoirs, and over 200 short stories published.
And that's how you know she's a phenomenal writer.
Yeah.
In such a short time.
So that's pretty much what I have about her. I don't know if there's anything else that you guys noted that I missed or wanted to mention.
No, I mean, it's funny. Like, I always just associate her with just The Lottery and The Haunting of Hill House, which I had never read until now. But I mean, I was, how sometimes there's someone and you like their work and then you read about their lives and then you're like, ugh, and how it kind of ruins it because I don't like that person. They sound like a terrible person. But I think I came out of the reading and hearing about her really liking her.
Yeah.
She just sort of seemed like a, I don't know, like a really interesting, smart, talented, but also just likable and kind of relatable.
Well, you get the struggle. You get the sense of the struggle.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's kind of heartbreaking. And there was a quote from, I think this was from her unfinished last novel that I just loved. I think it was something that one of the characters said, but it sounded like something that she would have said about herself. And it was something like, I'm a kind-hearted mama who studies evil all the time.
Yeah.
And that just sounded,
She had a duality to her for sure.
She did,
That's indicative of a duality. I think
Absolutely.
that she longed for companionship that was loyal. She just never found it. And when she thought she found it, maybe in female friends, it just never panned out. And then she also wanted to isolate herself from society, but also wanted companions. There was that one story about the servant girl that was with her that the podcast went over, like that when she was with a servant, there was a young lady who was living with her and taking care of the kids in the house.
Oh, was that the one that Laura was mentioning? The friend that Stanley ended up hooking up with?
Well, there was another girl who was a younger servant, I guess, or helper in the house. And she got Shirley out of bed one night and said,
yes,
there's a bird in my bed or something like that.
She was so creepy.
She was hallucinating.
That's right. I forgot about that.
And she was this was when she was going into madness. And Shirley sent her back to her family, the young lady, and she was heartbroken because she was very close to her.
Yes, the woman felt like she was having a nervous break. Like the servant had like a nervous breakdown, or she experienced like a supernatural thing or something. It was really creepy.
We didn't know. It could have been
creepy.
Very creepy story. Yeah. And then
the woman never came back.
The woman never came back. And
it made her sad because she really liked the woman.
It made her sad because she liked the woman, but then it spawned more work from her. Right. So it's that exploration of the descent into madness and these hallucinations from this episode of the servant girl that's so horrifying. But you can recognize she was fascinated by the occult and the darkness.
Right.
But she also had a very loving spirit as well. There's a strong duality there that makes her very fascinating as a character and a writer. Yeah.
Yeah. And I loved how they various times they'd say, there'd be, some critic would be, I think this was more like, earlier on, not now, but, confused by the fact that she could write like lighthearted things about her family and then also write these really dark things. And I think it's it's kind of, it's like people think women can't have that dark, side. It's like, oh, you're a mother. I mean, how could you be interested in, why would you write about someone being stoned to death? Or, it's like, like as if you have to be sort of one dimensional. You have to be a sweet little housewife. And that dark side was, disturbing and off-putting to people.
Especially then.
Yeah.
Right.
Because women aren't supposed to be like that. They can't have a dark side because they're supposed to be happy and beautiful and, like Mary Poppins all the time. Exactly. But really, if you have a dark side, I think this is for both sexes, though. I think people are freaked out by people that have a dark side.
That is, yes,
they do not like, well, why are you interested in serial killings? And why are you interested in the darker forces of life? And they're frightened by it. Yeah. So I know that's true for me. I love turning on a serial killer story. I love to learn about serial killers. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry if my family is listening to this right now. I'm really, but my mom would, and my sisters would always be like, why do you like all this dark stuff? Why are you reading so much Poe and Flannery O'Connor? And my plays are dark. So people don't. They're afraid of that because it hits a switch in them where they're just terrified. But there are some people that are very fascinated by darkness, too.
Life is dark.
Life is dark,
And
too.
I always think, always tell people, like, oh, did you see, I'll ask, like, some new horror movie. Oh, and people are always, oh, no, I can't watch that kind of thing. I don't watch anything scary. And then I say, oh, I love horror movies. And I get, like, these really looks. People are like backwards stepping away from me. I'm like, it doesn't mean I'm gonna, I'm not a violent person or anything.
No.
I'm a rather kind-hearted mama myself. I mean, but people don't like to see that duality and, especially in women. I think it's just like, off-putting to people.
It's scary. It's because women are supposed to be nurturers and lovely people. Sure. And I think that if you see, it's, if you look at a goth girl, think of a goth girl, like the darkness, like the dark lipstick and the, she could be a salt of the earth person or she could be giving seances, but people are afraid of that character because she's a girl and she's dark. So that's not right either. I think that, and Shirley could never show this side. Right. But, and then people were like, well, is she deranged? Does she have some kind of mental illness? What's going? They would ask that. So it's very interesting,
she's sort of a biographer's dream.
Of course.
Because there's a lot going on with her.
Yeah, she's fascinating.
Yeah, there's this, is her interesting life.
Yeah.
And ended too soon.
Yeah.
But all right, that's all good stuff. Let's get into the actual book. And Amanda, let me trouble you for a little bit more of this wine. We're drinking wine.
It's called Ghost Pines.
Ghost Pines.
Ooh, how appropriate.
Yes.
What did I have? A little Maker's Mark, and then I had to chase it with an espresso because I was like, oh no, I'll be too tired. So
now all we need is a gargoyle and some brandy. That would be perfect for this night. And it's very rainy tonight too, where we're brought, and
it's
windy.
Raining here too.
So there you go.
It's perfect weather.
Perfect time for Shirley Jackson.
Now we just need some thunder crackling in the background.
Yeah, or the lights dimming. Yeah. Like flickering on and off. Yeah.
So The Haunting of Hill House. It came out in 1959 from Viking Press. The quick synopsis of it that I came up with was after her mother's death, for whom she was a caretaker, Eleanor decides to take part in a research study and joins a scientist and two others for an extended stay in a supposedly haunted house. The events which transpire challenge the four in ways which go beyond the normal bounds of fear and superstition, and Eleanor quickly loses what fragile anchor she has in reality as she struggles to fit in among not only her peers, but the house and her very self. So that's kind of my quick summary of the book.
Right.
The actual origin of the story, as the biographer talked about, was that Shirley was driving to New York one day, and she saw like a burned out tenement building out of the corner of her eye, and it so disturbed her that she just decided she had to write about a haunted house. And she became obsessed about this idea, and she would drive around like looking at old houses, but she didn't apparently like the houses out in the East Coast where she lived, and she preferred sort of the more Victorian sort of, I guess they call it gingerbread style.
Right.
That was more popular out in California with these like buildings with odd angles and turrets and stuff.
Yeah.
And she actually, her mother, for however she was, she wrote to her and asked her to send pictures of like their ancestors' houses and stuff to get inspired.
Right.
Just like learning about that just made me think about the book's opening, which it starts off, well, not the very, very opening, but like the beginning of the book, Eleanor, the main character, she at some point is driving to the haunted house, and Jackson takes the time to describe the drive. And, you know, in writing, they talk about sometimes like walking up to the story. Like when people write a first draft of a story, they'll write the story and then they'll realize that they need to cut the beginning, because the beginning was actually them sometimes actually physically walking their character to the events that are interesting. And so like I remember I had a story once that I submitted to my writing group, and I remember they said, hey, this beginning part, all these like first whatever, how many pages, you should just cut that because, you know, nothing interesting really happens there. It's like you were kind of walking your character to the story. And when I first read this, I kind of thought that I was like, you know, when are we getting to the haunted house? When are we getting to the haunted house? Like, why are we spending so much time with her in the car? But like looking back on it, well, first of all, looking at her life, well, we know that she got her driver's license later in life. Right. And so how important driving was to her. So I can see where she would spend a little bit more time in it. And this is not a dense book. I mean, it's not long. So it's not like you're spending, you know, 100 pages in a car. But it's just a little bit longer. But it does allow you a chance to breathe and really kind of get a sense of who Eleanor is. Yeah. Which in the end is very, very important because of the transformation she goes through.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the character development of Eleanor is just incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what, without getting too ahead of it, one thing that I kept thinking was that, and this reminded me a little bit of Stephen King, although I think Shirley Jackson is possibly a better writer than him, more
Don't
consistent.
Tell Stephen.
I know, I love Stephen King, but a lot of his, I'm sorry, he can't always nail those endings. But what he's really good at is writing those characters and setting it up to this sort of like so normal, making everything seem so normal and almost cozy. And I kind of thought that about the beginning. It was like, you know, it wasn't like they were, you know, it was a dark and stormy night. It was like there was all this description of like, it was daytime and, you know, it was like the sun and the countryside. You know what I mean? It was that sort of, you knew something bad was going to happen, but everything was described in such a sort of ordinary
Well, like me and Amanda were talking before we started, like part of the drive, she talks about going through, I think, the town of Hillsdale, and she goes by these houses, and there's all those trees, those oleander trees. And she talks about the trees like protecting the buildings there. I think that's how she describes it. And it's almost like you can, as I'm now saying this, like you can think about Eleanor has almost like her guards up to the world. Like she's been so isolated because she's been caring for her mother.
Her mother is she's been extremely ill. She's been burdened with her mother. Right. The sister, first of all, you get she's terrible. Yeah. She's oppressive with her husband.
She's clearly not been helping with the mother.
She has not been there. And Eleanor has shouldered the burden of taking care of her mother who was, you know, throwing up and having all these, she had to clean up after her constantly. And then mom dies, and she sees her mom deteriorate. So that's burden. She's always given herself constantly and has never had a life of her own. So then eventually she is invited for this social experiment, and then she's able to...
It comes at the right time.
It comes at the right moment. And
when then, she like sort of like, she's been spending her whole life taking care of her, or whatever, the later part of her life taking care of her mother for a while. And now she doesn't know what to do with herself. And then this opportunity comes.
Right. But then her sister gives her a hard time and says, you know, half of that car is mine. Yeah. What if we're in the mountains and there's an accident with the child? We need the car. And she's like, I want the car. And finally she just steals off into the night and takes the car.
Which is a significant event for her.
That's a huge event.
For anyone, really.
Because then she breaks out into freedom. Yeah. And then what's so beautifully described is the journey to Hill House. She's driving through the countryside. She's leaving the city of Boston and going up into the countryside.
And she's feeling this like sense of adventure for the first time and that something's finally happening. And
and then she's eating it. She finds the girl and what is it? The cup of stars and the saucer.
There's a girl at the restaurant who was complaining to her mother that she wants her special cup with stars in the bottom of it.
Exactly.
Which comes up later in the story. Like,
and then she's also she's having her lunch, and it's by this beautiful brook that's falling, and she's enjoying the nature around the diner.
Right.
Stopping for coffee.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I think the world has opened up to her.
The world has opened up to her.
Yeah.
And
Briefly.
But in
this little sense of hope.
There's a sense of hope, but then you roll up to the house.
Yeah.
And you're starting to see, oh, this is even though it seems harmless.
But let me pause you for a second there, like, because it just made me think, like, this is much like Shirley's life. Like, I feel like she must have had these, like, these moments of hope, and then all of a sudden it just gets dashed away.
This is very indicative. That's what I was internalizing, was that this was Shirley's life. She'd have these moments of freedom, and then it would all be crashed down with heaviness.
Here's Stanley's new girlfriend.
Yeah, here they're in bed.
Right.
Oh, we had a servant girl and now she's crazy. You know, God. She got her hopes up and then they were destroyed again. So she is obviously, as a writer, she's putting herself into the writing. And this is the characterization of Eleanor. I feel that that's Shirley in some ways. In the way of shouldering burdens, maybe the burden of being a woman in the 50s, maybe not realizing her true potential as a writer that she could have had.
Right.
And then after she died, her stories are still famous, but did she achieve that fame? She achieved a little fame during her lifetime, but could she have achieved
not just a little?
A lot, but could she have achieved more is my question because of her circumstances.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's my take on that whole journey up to Hill House.
What about, I think this is in the beginning, don't they, in the very beginning, talk about the character of Eleanor's growing up and her experience with the poltergeist?
Yes. With the rocks on the house. The falling boulders on the roof.
There were 3 days of stones falling on the house, and the mother insisted it was the neighbors somehow, which
also makes you think of Shirley because she had problems with the neighbors. And
exactly. Yeah.
And felt isolated. So I looked, I don't know if that I was aware of this. There's a difference between a poltergeist and a spirit. A poltergeist is actually, it's a German word that means noisy ghost. And so poltergeists, I guess, are ghosts that actually will cause physical disturbances as opposed to...
They've got an attitude. Yeah.
Well, they'll actually
they're the
move
ones
things.
that'll smash plates or
they're
move
movers.
furniture, and they're not the ones that are going to just like drift silently
they're
through
not
a
happy.
room.
Yeah.
So it's not completely
and I don't think
random.
You see poltergeists either. It's like they're like
force
energy or something that. Yeah. So
it's not like the traditional
energy.
Apparition.
No.
Eleanor it's not like completely random that she goes to this research study. She does see the article in the newspaper or whatever, but the scientist, he sought her out, right? He
writes her a letter. He somehow finds her because that story must have been in a newspaper or something, and he writes her a letter.
Right.
He writes letters to all the people that,
and
he
some
thinks
people
have some...
answered.
He's looking for people that potentially have
some kind of psychic connection or connection
almost like
to
they're
the
live
spirit
wires.
world or
more susceptible to the spirit world.
They're more open to that or whatever.
Yeah, he doesn't want just anyone. Nope. And so he has this huge list, I don't know if it's like 60 people or something like that or whatever, and then it ends up only 2 people answer it. It's herself and then Theo, who is sort of a much different character.
Yes.
Almost like her opposite or like her alter ego almost.
Yeah, she's like sort of more...
And again, you get the pairing
self-confident.
You get the pairing of the female characters,
Absolutely.
the vamp character and the dowdy, more dainty character, which is characteristic in her novels. So you get Theo and Nell, which that's her nickname.
Yeah,
they say they're the dualities.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No. And in Theo, there's hints of lesbianism, but it's not outright. But I think
it's
there's
not outright.
subtle.
She's living with a friend in the city loft.
Right.
Yeah.
And she's an artist.
They've had a horrible, terrible quarrel of falling out. It didn't end well, and then she left to flee to the experiment because of the tension in the house between her and her friend. Now, one can assume that they were romantically linked. I mean, why would it be so tumultuous? But it's hinted at, but it's not like, hi, this is really happening,
Yeah.
But there's also a tenderness that Theo physically kind of gives to Eleanor, but it's more sisterly, the holding of her cheek, the stroking of her cheek, things like that. So.
Right, and she keeps describing Theo touching her. She's one of those people who touches people's arms and faces and stuff, and Eleanor's like recoiling from any kind of touch at the same time. So they're just like complete opposites. There's one line in the very beginning when they're describing Theo, and they say her world was one of delight and soft colors, which sounds like the opposite of Eleanor. But
don't you think that there's a part of her though that sort of clings to Theo?
Oh yeah.
So she's got this like kind of like like she's like repulsed by her and attracted to her. Like
absolutely. I think she's kind of obsessed with her eventually.
Yeah.
Well, don't forget too, Theo hasn't had a positive female contact in a while. She hasn't had any positive contact in a while, being with her mom.
Oh, you mean Eleanor?
Eleanor. That's what I meant. Yeah, right. Eleanor. She's been with her mom, then the quarrel,
and her sister's
terrible.
Yeah.
Right. So she hasn't really had that.
She's not had anyone who has been nice to her, doesn't seem like.
No, not at all. And Theo is nice now, so that's opening to her.
So the third character is Luke, who is actually one of the heirs of Hill House.
Right.
He feels like he's one of the gang, but he also sort of feels... like, because he's like an odd character to me because he's like an heir to the house, but he's like seems sort of disconnected from the house.
Well, yeah, he seems kind of like a rich boy who's gonna eventually inherit this, right? And he's not real invested in it.
Right.
I mean, but he's kind of there, I guess, to appease his aunt, his aunt is the one who she calls him a liar, or says he's going to steal the silverware or something. But he seems like a guy who's not really taking anything seriously.
No.
Yeah, that's a good description of him.
It's like he's got nothing better to do, so why not go to this, see what's happening with this, experiment or whatever.
He's like keeping an eye on what they're doing or something.
Supposedly.
I don't think he's really like a medium, in the way that Theo and Eleanor are.
I don't think he had any
just kind of there.
Yeah, he's just there.
He's just there.
And what did Theo have? What was her? She had like identified cards or something.
It's a psychic ability.
Right.
Yeah. But they don't ever demonstrate it, do they?
Like an ESP. No. There's a glimpse of it in the 63 version.
Oh, in the film.
In the film.
Right.
Not in the novel.
Not in the novel.
But in the film.
Dr. Montague, who was organized this little event, he's sort of like a stereotypical academic type, and his dialogue is, I found it humorous at times. He's kind of like, like, right you are, my boy. Like, pass me my brandy. And, like, he just kind of comes off as stiff, like, crusty.
Kind of Gatsby-esque, like, hey, old sport, the distinguished scholarly gentleman.
I mean, like, his dialogue made the book feel a little dated at times almost, but then, like, it had this, like, satirical quality that made it not dated.
Right.
And that's what I kind of got from it. But when he's like, all right, my boy, I'm like, what?
It's a type for sure. Yeah.
Those are pretty much the characters. And then you get the Dudley characters. You have the Mr. Dudley who greets...
I love Mr. Dudley.
And he's like barely in it, though.
Well, but
he's creepy.
He's creepy, and
he's literally the gatekeeper. He lets her in.
There's a quote, when we get to the film, I'll read a quote of his that I really enjoyed. Okay. But I found him very foreboding. Like, he appears all of a sudden, he's like, what are you doing here? Like, in all the versions, he's just, he is questioning why they'd even want to be there.
But he doesn't come back, right?
No, I think that's the only time we see him.
At the gate.
He's around, or he exists because, Mrs. Dudley's there.
Absolutely.
And she is there just during the day to prepare meals and clean up after the house.
Garden. They mentioned
so he's out in the garden.
Yeah, the garden there.
But she's an interesting character, Mrs. Dudley. She's got the sort of like, she just kind of has her catchphrases that she says.
She's almost robotic, and she just sort of repeats herself to everyone.
Yes, it's like extra creepy. I do this
at 1:00, and then I leave, and then it's
But what's strange though is that she's. In the film version, she's very robotic too. But then in the book, you get a whole conversation with her and Mrs. Montague.
Yes.
And I'm like, there was no indication. If you watch the film before you read the novel, there'll be a surprise that she's a little human in the novel.
Right.
But it's just a small little part.
Small kind of draws her out. Yeah.
But it's still something.
I feel like when you see that, that's one of the things where you're like, is Eleanor crazy? Because I see that as like, wait a second. was Mrs. Dudley creepy all along? Or now are we seeing, like, more the real Miss Dudley? Like,
right.
Is Eleanor's perception of what's going on, like, totally messed up?
Exactly.
Because we're seeing everything through Eleanor's eyes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Eleanor has, like, I put notes in here, like, progressive, sort of repetitive dialogue and thoughts. She's always repeating things in
almost
kind of
like
odd
invasive thoughts. That line about journeys end.
Journeys end in lovers' meeting. So I looked that up. That's actually a quote from the character of the Fool in Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare.
Interesting.
Okay.
And that play is about separated twin siblings, mistaken identities, and a love triangle, which kind of fits in with this, because there's, like, sort of, even though, like, it's hinted that Theo has lesbian leanings, there is sort of, like, a tension between her and Eleanor and Luke.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really totally develop, but there's definitely a love triangle in sort of jealousies and, like, and Eleanor's like, are they talking about me, and stuff like that.
It's a paranoia.
Well, even just that, like, yeah. She wants to be part of the gang, and she's, part of the crowd. She wants to belong.
Yeah. She's like, she's sort of like the odd woman out at times.
Right.
She certainly feels that way and expresses it in her thoughts, which we're privy to. And she has these dark thoughts, like you were talking about, Laura. And she has this changing attitude toward Theo. Mm-hmm. I mean, at one point, I think she talks about, like, dashing her head in or something.
Oh, yeah.
Like, she has these, like, morbid thoughts.
Yep.
And yet, she's also always, like, self-conscious and worrying about embarrassing herself and saying the wrong thing.
Exactly.
Right.
And she has, like, these sort of moments of disassociation where she doesn't, like, recall, like, what she did or what she said. Right. And she's always, like, worried, like, what did I say? What did I say? Did I embarrass
she'll even
myself?
Doubt sometimes that any of it's happening. And right? She's sometimes wondering, is this all in my head? Oh, God. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess Theo is a total contrast, because Theo seems to be very confident.
Right.
I guess
Right.
Luke does.
And sure of herself. Totally. Both of them. Very sure of themselves.
Yeah. Right. And Eleanor is just, like, nothing but doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget, too, though, that she's been sheltered, too, in her house. That's
I think,
so isolated.
So isolated. And this is the first, like I said, this is the first contact she's had in a long time where she's learning social graces again.
Right. Her social skills are rusty.
There's a fine line between is Eleanor insane? Is the house making her insane?
Yeah.
Are there really dark forces in the house that she's really seeing? Those are all questions that pop up, at least for me, when I was reading the text. Well,
that's what makes this book so great.
Is you can't tell.
Yeah.
Or is she haunted? Is she haunted?
Exactly.
And she's she's sort of manifesting this stuff that just happens to be in the house, but it's really her.
But it's not it's not totally all in her mind, because there are moments where the other people acknowledge what she sees.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like, there's writing on the wall. They all see it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's a cold spot. They all feel it.
And for it to be supernatural, for sure.
Yeah.
But yet, even though there's clearly supernatural events or things that are unexplained that they all experience, this is where this book is really genius, because you have that where all the characters are saying, yes, we're all seeing something strange. It seems like there's, like, a supernatural act going on. But yet, even with that confirmation by outside parties, because we're in Eleanor's head and we're going through all her doubt, we still wonder, is this really happening?
Right.
Because something is going on with her.
Yeah.
And besides just the supernatural events, or in conjunction with them, or alongside them. And that's what makes this just...
It's so unsettling.
Yeah, so unsettling.
Very
and so
unsettling.
Genius, and, like, the way that Jackson subtly weaves that in,
right,
as a progression. It's really amazing. But you mentioned, or we've constantly mentioned, Eleanor's relationship with her mother and her sister as being strained. And what I found was most depressing is near the end, when Eleanor is sort of reflecting that her mother's death was inevitable, and it was inevitable that it was always going to be her fault.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Because she was the only one taking care of her, so of course she was going to die on her watch.
Yeah. But and then she knew she was going to feel guilty about it and blame herself, no matter what.
Awful.
Well, her sister did that to her too.
Yeah.
Her sister. And the husband isn't much better. Her sister, her brother-in-law is a terrible man as well. I think she has is it a niece in the novel? Or
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's a niece.
the little girl.
Or is it a boy?
Or is it a boy or a girl? I can't
think it's a little girl in the novel.
A little girl in the
movie.
novel, and a boy in the movie, and then a little girl in the 63 version.
Right. Yeah.
But like that kid's a brat.
Yeah.
Like she's not a good kid, and like you're thinking
Eleanor doesn't have a great
She doesn't
home life.
have a break at all. This woman that doesn't have anything in her
Yeah.
home life whatsoever, and it makes it even sadder. Yeah. It's a sad beginning to her.
What were the comments about Luke's mother? Like they say that Luke doesn't have a mother.
What was her name? Mrs. Sanderstorm or something?
They talk about
that was
his aunt.
strange, where she's sort of that one conversation that she has with Luke, right?
Well, no, I thought, doesn't Theo say Luke doesn't have a mother?
But Eleanor discovers that first. Remember, there's a little scene where she's talking to Luke and she's kind of trying to, get to know him a little bit. And it's a little bit suggestive of like maybe, she have a thing for him or what. But then he says,
it's almost like the scene like in Paradise Island or one of these reality shows where they're off on their own.
Exactly.
Having their own little private date.
Yeah, and you're like, something's going to be revealed. But she's kind of disappointed because he just reveals that his mother had died when he was young. And it's sort of like, I don't know, feels like
so that's what happened. He said his mother died when he was young.
I think so.
I couldn't remember that.
I'm looking for it now.
Yeah, that I can't remember that detail.
Because then she's disappointed later.
Absent.
Right. She's kind of, it's just a small little scene, but then later Theo says something about Luke's mother, and then Eleanor kind of realizes he had told Theo the same thing. And then it's sort of like, it wasn't like he told her something in confidence or something that was, some deep-seated...
It is just like The Bachelor.
Jealousy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Little snippets here and there. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just more of like, she thought she was getting something in private. But it's interesting that it's about a mother and that she's got issues with her mother.
And now he has issues. He never had a mother.
Yeah.
So there's that abandonment, too. There was never that womanly direction for him. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's change directions here. There was another podcast I listened to called This Is Horror Podcast, and they talked about Shirley Jackson having like humorous and satirical elements in this story, I believe. They're definitely there. I mean, I mentioned this stuff about kind of laughing at some of the doctor's dialogue, and whatever the intention of that, the visit of the doctor's wife.
Absolutely, yeah.
She comes in like a whirlwind.
Oh,
yeah,
gosh.
that's like breaks the tension a little. It's a little comic relief or something.
Totally. I mean, it almost feels like artificial, but you kind of love it. And it ends up fitting very well because it's an interesting contrast. First of all, the mother comes, she's not alone. She's got this...
Arthur, right?
Yeah, Arthur, this
Arthur,
random school teacher who I guess is...
odd.
He's like a sycophant to her. He just like, he believes in... It's so fascinating because Arthur and Dr. Montague's wife believe in spirits, and they have almost like a side business where they go and check out spirits, but they don't believe like anything that's going on in this house.
Right. And they never witness anything weird, right? I mean, there's none of the sounds or anything.
They just said the twig was tapping against the window.
Right.
They don't notice any.
So ironically, they don't,
Even when stuff is going on, when the rest of them are all held up in that one room, in was it Eleanor's room?
Yeah.
And there's like the house is like coming alive with stuff. Like Arthur and Dr. Montague's wife are just like sleeping in the rooms doing nothing.
They didn't get anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're looking for it the most.
Right. They're the
and
ones
she's getting
that think
frustrated.
and she feels that she's very in touch with the spirit world, right? Because of planchette, which I love that she calls it planchette, like not like the planchette. It's like it's a character.
Yes, she does. Why don't you explain what planchette is, Laura? Did you look it up at all? It's like kind of like a Ouija board, but it's different. Yeah,
isn't it? It is kind of like a Ouija board, but it's like spells things out, which a Ouija board does too. I don't know.
But a Ouija board, I believe, has letters, and I think planchette.
Right, the planchette has a little pencil or something. It'll write it out. Right. Okay. I mean, they call that, the little heart-shaped thing on a Ouija board. That's called a planchette, also. So that was confusing to me. Yeah. I mean, it's really. They're the same. It's the same concept, I think.
I guess the planchette, what Mrs. Montague was trying to do was automatic writing or spirit writing. So she would sit in a room with Arthur, and she would just like take this device and like let it guide her into actually like she would yell out questions or something, and then answers would come supposedly. But then I think she got some answers. and then she questioned everyone about him, but it didn't lead anywhere.
No.
And then later on, she was very frustrated because she wasn't getting any answers, and she blamed everyone else for
I'm sorry,
Right.
but that's the hilarious part.
Yeah.
Is here she is trying so hard to make contact, and then they're completely making contact. They're
terrified.
They're terrified, hauled up in a room, like being haunted and terrorized by these spirits and the coldness and the winds and the poltergeists, and she didn't get anything but a twig tapping on a window.
Right.
So
and
it's
she's
like,
pissed at the rest of them as if they ruined it, even though they've just been through this like horrific night of terror.
she's upset. It's
She's like this larger than life character that just
She
goes around espousing her thoughts, and she's critiquing the meals and
I don't think
criticizing.
she wouldn't, if she was a real person, you wouldn't want to be in the same room with this woman.
Oh God, no.
She'd be a horrible boorish.
No.
Well, the doctor, he kind of
She was
shrinks
sucking all
around
the
her.
oxygen out of the
And
room.
it's terrible because he's portrayed as kind of a grandfatherly,
Right.
intelligent man, and here's this domineering wife with, as you said, the sycophant assistant, and they're walking around like it's like. Have you ever
He's
seen
got a loaded pistol.
like Beetlejuice, like with
Yes.
the
what a good
lady
comparison.
and the weird guy, and they're trying to they start
Oh,
doing
yeah.
the dance.
I wonder if that's inspired from this.
Maybe, I don't know.
Right.
It would be funny
Delia
if it was.
And,
What's his name? But he's very flamboyant.
Yes, yes. And they come and they feel like they've got this,
They have the
that is
connection
like
with
that.
the spiritual world.
Yeah,
And then I wonder if that was inspired from this novel.
That's what I'm saying. It must have
Oh
been.
my
If that
God.
would
It
have been
seems like
good
it.
to know. I mean, if we can research that, but like that's the ironic, that's the humor of Shirley, is that sometimes people who want to get in touch with the spiritual world can't even do it, and they appear comical and they're flamboyant and just ridiculous and outlandish. So she's over the top in characterization, and you wouldn't want to know her in real life, probably. You'd be
that
like,
is
get
so
me out
funny.
of this room. Yeah.
That is just like Beetlejuice. Now
Yeah.
I,
It
now
really
I want to
is,
like
yeah.
look
That
at
scene.
Otho. Otho was that character.
That's it. They just,
Delia
and then they,
and Otho.
yep. I'm wondering if it's from that.
Well, it's absolutely because, and of course, they don't see. Here's the daughter seeing the ghosts all the time, and they're they don't see them.
And then the same actor played the past. Have you seen the movie Heathers?
Oh,
the
yeah.
same actor played the priest who
Yes.
was at the funeral of
Yes,
the
he
jocks, and this actor is typecast in playing flamboyant, over the top
Yes,
characters.
definitely.
So it's the same
He's great.
concept as these ridiculous people that just, and there's people like that in real life who have. My sister had a guy who was a supernatural carpet cleaner. He'd clean carpets, but then he'd test for ghosts. And
my
we'd
God.
joke about him. And like, did you find anything on the meter while you were cleaning the Indian, print here? And it was ridiculous. So those
my
types of
gosh.
people, but
Thorough cleaning.
they're cleaning.
Yeah,
And
hey.
also the spiritual world. But yeah,
That is so
same
funny.
concept.
Well, Shirley Jackson throws a couple, I call them like world building elements because I'm just used to reading fantasy, but she mentions a bunch of like real life haunted places. A couple of them are Glamis Castle and the Borley Rectory. And I listen to some podcasts today just to try to learn about those. Like there were actual places, like the Borley Rectory was made famous by accountings from this parapsychologist who went from, the place was supposed to be haunted, but when this guy started investigating it, it went from having just apparitions to poltergeists. Some of the events that happened there included writing on a wall, and this parapsychologist actually rented the house out for a year and took out an ad for people to come and stay there, and he had them stay there in rotating
boy.
shifts and asked them to document their stay. The rectory was near a church, and there was cold spots that happened there. So all that stuff reminds me of this story.
Right.
And I'm
Absolutely.
sure that Shirley was familiar with it. Glamis Castle was actually named in Macbeth. It's a famous castle in Scotland, although the actual King Macbeth I don't think have any actual history with it, but it is in Macbeth. And so I feel like these elements all kind of add up to this being sort of like the archetypal haunted house story. There is sort of a progression of events that happen. You got this writing in chalk, and then there's writing in blood, And then there's allusions to an executioner. I think that's when Eleanor is like thinking about hurting Theo.
Well, she really turns on Theo in the writing scene.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. She really, because that's kind of when, that's like the first hint of like, all of a sudden it's not the 4 of them, it's the 3 of them and her.
Yep.
Because they all kind of go, well, dear, are you sure it wasn't you? And Theo, that's when she kind of, pins her down, starts kind of accusing Eleanor of doing it for attention, and then goes, ha, I was just kidding you were scared. Now I broke the tension by it. But and Eleanor's thinking,
she just flips out.
Yeah. And then Eleanor kind of hates her after that.
Yeah. She's not pleased with saying that she did it herself.
Right.
Eleanor's like, what are you talking about right now?
Right. And she kind of turns on her about her hair, too. Because Theo had said to her, I'll help you have a new hairstyle. And, she's all kind of sweet and solicitive. And then, then she turns and says, well, if you didn't want attention, why do you have a new hairstyle? So that scene was kind of chilling. It's like, oh, God, she is all alone in this house. These people don't really like her that much, or they don't really get her.
You keep thinking about Shirley Jackson when you read this stuff, and you read all this stuff, like, and being agoraphobic and feeling isolated in her town.
And abandoned.
Yep.
And not fitting in.
Yeah. Like just kind of the outsider again.
Yeah.
So the story when they get in the house, they discover this library, which is in this old tower, and Eleanor can't go in there. And the legends around the house is that, what was it? Someone committed suicide from that tower, right? They hung themselves or something like that.
The old lady's like companion, the old lady who had owned the house, her companion had been driven to suicide.
The young village girl that was the
companion. And that would be Luke's descendant or ancestors, right?
I think so.
I think so, yeah.
It was these ladies who owned it, and then their companion somehow inherited it, right?
She did.
The Sanderson family.
And then everyone in the village hated her for that, and she became completely isolated. And hated, and nobody, would.
And then the story kind of, at the end, Eleanor, the way I took it, sort of almost reenacts what the ghosts were doing.
Right.
And she sort of like follows the footsteps of this legend of suicide. And her dialogue gets even more disturbing. I have some quotes here I pull out. She starts talking like third person, like she's including almost like herself in the house. She's like, we tricked them so easily. She says, I am home. I'm walled up alive.
So creepy.
She's a conduit to that.
She is. Well, then it's like, is the house kind of
possessing
getting in her head, or is it just or were those stories of the suicide and the hauntings and everything so suggestive to her like fragile state of mind that she's, I don't know.
She's just spiraling into insanity, and then she internalized the stories.
Right.
Yeah, there's like an event where doesn't she like pass out or something? Like she's like doesn't know what happened. Like I feel like she starts to lose track of time and events.
Yeah.
And then there's the stair scene, the spiral stairs.
Yeah, she finally goes into the library where she's afraid to go.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the stairs are collapsing because the professor goes after her.
No, well,
Luke goes after her in the book. Luke goes
after her in the book, but then in the movie, the professor.
Right.
But like they can't hold.
That's what's interesting because
both of them.
Right.
The legend is there's a suicide on the staircase, so we know that if there's a haunting, it's associated with there. So when Eleanor goes up the staircase and she seems like she's possessed by the house. She goes up this rickety staircase. They have to talk her down. Yep. You think that that's where it's all going to culminate.
Yeah. Right.
Because like that's where you would go with the story.
Right.
It's like she's going to succumb to the legend.
Right.
But then they do talk her down successfully.
Yeah.
And that's when I was like, well, this ending is really kind of original. I mean,
they lull you in. Then they're like, oh no, they got her down. She's, know, how sad. She's going to be sent away.
And then they're like, we have to get you away from this house.
Right.
Yeah.
The house is causing this. So they want to send her away. But then they send her away alone in her car. And she's driving, and then she's like, I can't leave. The house won't let me leave.
Yeah.
And she's like, and she kind of is almost like, I'm going to show them. And doesn't she she turns around, or she ends up just speeding right into a tree.
Crashes into a tree. Yeah. Right.
Which I thought was interesting. She doesn't go, and they're all outside watching this, right? So she doesn't go after them. She doesn't go crash into the house.
No.
Crashes into the tree.
So she's still on the grounds, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But hadn't the first wife of the guy who built the house her horse and cart had crashed into that tree?
And
she
I forgot
one.
about that.
The same
yeah,
one.
so that was in the back of her head too, because the doctor had talked about that.
I forgot about that.
So, all these things are kind of in her head.
Yeah,
and
she's
she also thinks
it.
she thinks right before she does it, why don't they stop me?
Yes.
Right.
That was so
it's
chilling.
It's almost like there's points where those spirits have possessed her because she's reenacting all the deaths almost. Yeah. So you're wondering, is the spirit inside of her? It's not Eleanor anymore.
I wonder, is this house like claiming another ghost for itself?
Another victim.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, it wants another ghost, like, to haunt the grounds. Like, wasn't the last line something about treading alone or something?
It basically kind of mirrors
Walking
that
alone.
opening part. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. It absolutely is actually a line from the beginning. They repeat it.
Do you have it in front of you?
I have it in front of me.
Read the last line.
So the last two sentences are: Hill House itself, not sane, stood against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, its walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone.
So that's interesting.
Right. And of course, poor Eleanor is still alone. She was alone in the beginning.
And she's alone again.
Yeah, she thought she would found her. And I kind of thought, it seemed like, it's that she was wanting to find a home or kind of like a place where she belonged, and she really felt like she was kind of belonging with the three others there, which
at times she felt like she did, and at times she didn't.
Right. Well, at first she kind of did, and I don't want to get in too much into the movie, but it's in the stark contrast to the 63 version, because they start out quite warm and inviting and welcoming to her, and she keeps thinking in her head, they like me, we're friends, I'm one of them. She keeps kind of thinking that, and then at some point she suddenly realizes she stands alone, and then the other three are kind of, the doctor's got his wife there, he's clearly got this whole life. Theo won't let her move in with her after they leave.
Oh yeah, she gets real obsessive with Theo, and she's like, "I'm gonna move in with you."
Oh yeah.
And there's actually like a part where I was reading it, and there were a couple of scenes where the various characters were talking about the other people in the house, just what they were doing or where they might be or whatever, and then nobody was mentioning her. Did you guys notice that part? Because for a second I thought, my God, is this going to be some weird twist where like she's been a ghost, like she didn't really exist?
Right.
It
sounded like it.
Yeah.
Felt like that.
Yeah.
She did. Yeah.
But
that's how disturbed she was.
She was very disturbed, but what's interesting about the passage you read is the physical description of the house.
Right.
The floors were firm, and the doors were sensibly silence lay steadily against the wood. Those are all images of heaviness to me.
Yeah.
Remember the doors?
Heavy.
The doors automatically closed.
They
We
just
forgot to talk about
shut.
that.
Yes.
So the house is weighing down on them. You hear a lot of descriptions of the immensity and the darkness of the house.
Right.
Maybe because there's also that sinister element of the deaths in the house too. So
and
that
they get
adds to
lost in the house frequently.
Right. The layout's real weird. The
It's
angles
weird.
are all off, which was
Done purposely
unsettling.
Yeah.
The book they find a book to Crane's child, and it's written in his blood on the last page. The
it's all
corner.
about hell and
It's about like the 7 deadly sins.
Right.
Yeah, then there's a corner that's singed he writes that I saw it shriveling into the flame. And then you realize the horror of it all. He's reading it to his child. It's like it's a book.
It's a memory book for his child.
And it's written in blood on the last page.
Oh my God.
And it's like, but these children had to witness this insanity. So there's that heaviness too. There's a history of insanity, of deaths. The house is dark and morose, and there's like statues and images and just like the children and the nursery, and it's creepy. There's toys, but it's creepy looking down on them. So it's not, there's a bad energy in the house, and then she eventually is part of the bad energy because she died there too. Yeah. Eleanor. So that's the sense. It's like, oh, here we go.
It's so sad.
Is she finally home at the end?
Sounds like she is, because she's not going anywhere. She rejoined those spirits, so she's trapped with them in that house. So that adds to more heaviness in Hill House. And no one's really lived in Hill House either. For many years, it's been empty.
Yeah. Right.
So if you think of haunted houses being abandoned for a long time, there's an isolation there. And it's like that even adds to it, the unoccupiedness of it all. So, yeah.
All right. Well, why don't we stop there about the book and kind of just do our final comments and our star rating. Mm-hmm. And then we can just kind of wrap things up and get into the movies and next episode. I'll start things off, I guess. I'm going to give this book 5 stars. I think it's a quick read. The prose is not dense. It's sparse. I've read other authors like this, but there is just a really compelling genius behind it that you pick up on as you go along. And it's really the most fascinating thing to me, I guess, is how this is a book from, years ago. And there's been many haunted house stories told since then, and you're familiar with them growing up, watching TV and movies and stuff. So you read a book like this from before, and you think like, oh, this is going to be like I know this story, even though I don't know it. But like you talk about Beetlejuice, I'm familiar with that, and yet the ending was disturbing, and I was like struck by this book, even though like I should kind of be familiar with this archetype. So I think that's why I give it 5 stars. It's just like even all these years later, in my jadedness, being a reader for years and consumer of media, I still thought this was just great. So I'll give it 5 stars. So Laura, let's go to you next. Out of 5.
I absolutely loved it. And I not to sound, I always kind of avoided it because I thought, well, like I've seen this 63 movie. I saw the 1963 movie years ago, and I was like, I don't know. It's a ghost story, which is not like my favorite. And I kind of felt like that, like it was going to be kind of old or dated or something, but man, it totally holds up. I thought it was great, and it draws you in. I mean, it is a fast read because you do get kind of, I got really, absorbed in that character, even though the character was she was kind of disturbing. But I don't know. I thought it was really well written, and I thought her characters were really well written, and I thought unlike Stephen King, she nailed the ending. It was kind of a twist, but not really like not an M. Night Shyamalan style stupid twist, but a good. It was unexpected and jarring and haunting, really. So yeah, I loved it. I'll give it 5 stars too.
Yeah, Amanda, what about you?
If I could give this book 10 stars, I'd give it 10 stars. It's 5 stars and above for me.
Yeah.
I think Jackson is a brilliant writer. I think, how could she have made a character of a house? There is a characterization. It's almost like the house is a character too.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
There's such an ominous presence of the house throughout the novel, and it takes a lot of talent to make something that's not alive with darker spirits, but also spirits that suck in an innocent person. Mm-hmm. So she does a brilliant job of interweaving characterization with a deep psychic phenomenon of can you be sucked into something so much through supposition that it leads you to insanity and eventually to death, and you're trapped there and the house basically consumed you. That is amazing to me. Mm-hmm. And I haven't seen, what struck me is I really haven't seen a writer as original as that. It's
because I feel like it's because she doesn't commit one way or another. She's not like, this is a psychological experience only, or this is a supernatural experience only.
She's
not trying to be a genre writer.
No, she's not. It's both, and there's no declaration of either side.
Right.
And that is brilliant because it keeps you stay in the story.
Yeah.
And then once you read it, you want to go back to it and read it again to see if you've missed anything.
Right.
Or because maybe you did, but you didn't. It's just not there. It's up to you. So that's the part that's so 5 stars, hands down.
She also does it in a lot fewer words than Stephen King would do.
Which
Absolutely.
is also
Stephen, I love you, but you need a better editor.
It's too verbose, and she is not.
He's good.
Verbose.
He's
good.
Yeah.
Stephen King, we
great.
love you.
Love him.
Yeah.
Don't think we don't. Keep playing in your band with other writers. It's great.
Yeah.
But like she captures it in less words, and the sentiment is just as heavy, if not more, because of her sparseness. So
well, all right. Let me stop us there. I will invite everyone to go check out our website, www.nodeodorant.com. Please subscribe to the podcast and write reviews. We're on Apple Podcasts, on Stitcher Radio, TuneIn Radio, YouTube, just pretty much all the places you can get podcasts. So stay tuned for later in the month where we are going to discuss the film versions of The Haunting of Hill House. Until then, we'll say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
For more information on the topics discussed in this episode, or to read our show notes and find us on social media, visit nodeodorant.com. For more information on Ryan Sean O'Reilly and his various works of fiction, visit ryanseanoreilly.com. The theme music for this podcast was written by John Doyle from the band I Decline. You can visit him at i-decline.com. Voiceover for this podcast was provided by me, Margaret O'Reilly. Well, that concludes our episode. We hope you've learned a lot. Again, thanks for listening to our show. And always remember, there is no deodorant in outer space.
All right, any
I took
questions?
No notes, so I'm counting on you guys for all the facts and dates and things. I took some notes in my book. That was it.
That works.
That still no.
That works.
That works.
All right, then I'll start us off with this quote, and then we'll just kind of be off to the races. We'll just get into it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, in 5, in 4, wait, let me move this because I'm kind of... Everything is...
Oh, yeah, you have the stand.
Everything is connected to everything else, so that's great.
Yes. Domino effect.
Yeah. Okay.
No.
Because I'm like doing this and this. All right.